The Spinoff Podcast Network.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. The Investment Fix podcast. Tune in today.
The Fold is brought to you by oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Kia ora and welcome to The Fold. My guest this week is Tony Bradbourne, who is the CEO and founder of Special Group. They are a creative agency born maybe a kilometre away from where I'm recording this right now. We're in Morningside and they were birthed up the road in Kingsland. And yet as of right now, they are also a multinational with offices in Sydney, Melbourne and in the US. And they have also expanded vertically to encompass media, design, and what they call PR, but they actually mean something a lot broader than that, and we get into that on this chat. And you know, they're an agency that has won some huge clients within New Zealand, most notably Tourism New Zealand, which is kind of in some ways one of the big figurehead everyone wants it accounts within the New Zealand creative space. And we talk about that extensively because there's so much of the evolving world and of government that you can see through that client. They've also won some massive international clients, including Uber Eats, which they initially won for Australia and now do for the US and Canada and other territories beside. Out of that came their first Superbowl commercial, which is very much a super unlikely bucket list kind of a thing for any creative agency to ever create. And yet at the same time, Tony is not someone for whom there's a ton of media around. You know, Alice Webler-Dahl, my producer, did some research on him and unearthed a grand total of 2 stories that he'd been associated with in New Zealand. So there is to some extent a sense that Special Group do their thing and don't necessarily participate in the same singing of their own sweetness that the kind of the other big New Zealand agencies do. And the difference between a locally born and still independent agency versus the multinationals that are here and still dominate the New Zealand marketplace is something that we talk about. One of the things that Special have always seemed to pride themselves on is how to, I guess, think about the whole of the campaign, not just the 30 or 60 second TVC that is a lovely piece of film, but and will attract a big audience that you can blunt force trauma into by spending money on television, but also the long tail of it splintering across all of the different social and other channels that you might find it in. And, you know, caring about that audience that's hard to reach and that requires a lot of different smaller pieces and more intricate plotting and thinking versus the one big thing that feels ultimately like the past. That's kind of what, you know, regular listeners to the Fold will know that's a real abiding obsession of mine, is this kind of where is the coming audience versus the going, and it's something that Tony and his team think very deeply about as well. Now, The Fold is proudly supported by Vodafone, who bring you innovation made simple and world-class network technology, which will help you maximize the potential of you and your business. Find out more at vodafone.co.nz. This is The Fold with Tony Bradbourne, CEO and founder of Special Group. Kia ora, Tony, and welcome to The Fold.
Great to be here, thank you.
I wonder if you could start by explaining to our listeners what Special Group is, because it is a bit different from its sort of competitor set.
We are a creative agency, a creative company, and we generally play in the space of advertising, design, and innovation in all the different parts we can play with to be able to help the brands we work with. And
what was that? Was it always the intention? You know, you're you're about, what is it, like 11 years or so?
Probably about 13 years now. It's ticking on a bit. Yeah, it seems to race by, and in some ways it feels like we're only brand new, but in other ways it feels like we're becoming more and more, more and more broader in terms of our reach. Yeah.
Do you feel like the industry, well it clearly has it's experienced extraordinary change over the time Special's been around. But what are the sort of, to what extent have you seen that change, and how has it manifest? And do you think that the agency world has kept pace with the overall change in society in that time?
Yeah, I mean, on the whole, I think agencies have to adapt and constantly change, and there's big disruptions coming through. I mean, we were, as I said, 13 years old. We're actually younger than Facebook, so we were born in the digital age. And so the amount of different channels we can play in now, the amount of different tools we can play with is definitely broader than when I first got into this industry, when it was really dominated by television and press ads, which I used to love.
Yeah, I mean, the thing that kind of, as an outsider observing the industry, is that era of press ads and particularly big TV commercials, it was like simple. I mean, those were a cultural form unto themselves. It kind of made sense. Like everyone could eat off of that, from the media to the agencies, and it worked for the brands and so on. And there's been this kind of huge, chaotic, convulsive disruption that's come since. And it still feels to me like there are people, both on the media side, understandably, but also within kind of creative agencies, media agencies, within brands for whom the nostalgia for that era is so powerful that they struggle to understand how much change has happened and how they might reimagine communication for this far more complex era. Is that fair?
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. Like, for a large number of our clients, and it all comes down to the target audience. Who are you trying to reach? Who are you trying to talk to? Who are you trying to emotionally engage with? And for many of them, television is still an incredible medium. It's one of the best mediums to create emotion and connection and storytelling and repetitive storytelling. And so that is still a fantastic medium. But if you've got children, you will notice how little traditional television they watch. And so then if you look at that audience there, or a younger audience or an under 30 audience, you will have to find different ways of reaching them and the channels that is their world now, because it's not the world that I grew up in, which there was 1, 2, 3 different television channels. There was movie, there was out of home, there was magazine and newspaper. And now you would say that the majority of under 30 audience really have got such a wide variety of different channels. It's
gone from a sort of tightly controlled mass audience market of the one that you described to a whole bunch of kind of wildly differing offerings, from the sort of wilds of YouTube, where you have very little, if you're trying to market within there, you've got very little kind of control of or real sense of what you are pre-rolling or mid-rolling through, and there can be some pretty gnarly stuff on there that you wouldn't naturally place your inventory with, down to, on the other side, the biggest and fastest growing new channels, Netflix and Disney Plus, both of which are completely ad-free environments for now. How do you kind of navigate that, and do you think that the whole sort of industry in New Zealand has done a decent job of sort of forcing its clients to reckon with that new reality?
It's I think some do, yes, some do badly, of course. It's a constant state of having to learn and having to understand about these different channels and how you can play in there. The message lengths you get to play with become shorter or different. And then the other thing about it is that it's also brands we work on is an interesting one, is that educating them about what the shape of the campaigns are going to look like, because they will probably come off a predetermined opinion that it is going to be those more traditional channels. They grow up watching 60-second TVCs, so they're expecting to see a 60-second TVC. So a lot of that comes a bit about really understanding the audience and actually what are all the different touch points that audience go through throughout a day, a week, etc. And I think it's not just one channel; it's the different channels and how they all work together. And different channels can carry messages in different ways. You've got outdoor, which is traditionally you have to try and get your point across in 1, 2, 3 seconds. But then that is a companion medium with a piece of video you might see, and whether that video is on Instagram or whether it is on YouTube. The other interesting thing about that, I should say, is some of the greatest ads in the world, they get played a lot on, or people seek them out on YouTube, or they get discovered on YouTube just because they're such amazing pieces of storytelling in a film. So even though you're not placing them in traditional mediums, you'll still see a 60-second or a 2-minute amazing piece of film come up on your YouTube feed anyway. Yeah,
that level of sort of opt-in, lean-forward consumption, which there was no way of disseminating it particularly historically, is very different now. And you see the really great campaigns, and you've had a few of them that somehow managed to capture and feel like the thing that the internet is talking about or consuming, or one of the main ones of that day. And that's and
that really is the goal, I think, of any modern marketing campaign, is that it needs to have a PR component at the heart of it. It has to be an idea or a concept that just gets spoken about, and whether that's in traditional comms or whether it's amongst friend groups or whether it's the thing you talk about when you gather at the pub. So there is the shape of the modern campaign is a lot more interesting in my mind, because it has to involve all these different channels you can play with. It has to be an idea that people love and they'll see in different ways, shapes, forms, lengths.
I mean, when you use that phrase PR, because I've always found that, like, the traditional view of PR is a representative of a company or a government department who reaches out to a journalist to try and seed a story with them. But you're using it much more in a kind of almost like the social media response, the kind of, or the level of cultural cut through that it gets. And that's effectively decided by the audience. Yeah, I mean,
I guess PR is almost a bit of an outdated term, the same as advertising, I think, is a bit of an outdated term. When you think of advertising, you think of a 30-second television ad that disrupts you and has got a retail message and a loud voiceover, etc. So I think that is, about 20 years out of date as well. So when I talk about PR, I guess I should talk about talkability, excitement around a campaign that gets shared, that gets commented about, that gets picked up by traditional media, that gets spoken about in overseas news channels, which then New Zealand news channels pick up on the fact that a New Zealand campaign is getting spoken about overseas, etc. So it's to me, modern PR is really about all of those different aspects, and it could involve activations, it could involve influencers, all of those different bits. And so that makes it really, really exciting, because you've got all these different channels you can play in, and they have to all play together to create a very, very effective and liked modern campaign that sits well in culture.
So one critique I've heard of the agency world in New Zealand is that it is still very much focused on the big, grand, glossy 30 to 60 second TVC, and doesn't think particularly hard about that sort of long tail of how you reach viewers or audiences that aren't committed to linear television. And so inevitably, you still want to be there, this brand still wants to be there, but that message gets picked up, handed to, the sort of a junior copywriter at a radio station or the social media manager for a magazine, and there's just not as much care and craft in that, and it's further away from that big, beautiful, very well thought through and strategic piece itself. And, as a result, it just doesn't feel like that audience or those other audiences are as important to the brand or the organization as the big loyal TV audience. Do you think that's a sort of a fair summation?
Yeah, I guess everything at the heart of special, it comes back down to what's the strategy and what's the point and what are we trying to achieve on our brands that we work with behalf. So once you have got that really, really clear strategy, then it's just about how do you apply it best to the different channels. So I think it has to have that consistency of strategy and thought and reason for being, and that's how you can check whether and test to see how effective the campaign is and whether you iterate that campaign or whether you change different bits up or down, etc. But everything has to be linked into a consistent, brand strategy of what you're trying to do. So that's the number one way of keeping a consistent campaign, even though you're across multiple different channels.
Is there an example that you've worked on recently which you feel like kind of exemplifies that, and like how many different kind of pieces was that composed of, if that's an answerable question?
Here's a really good one. It's a campaign that hasn't really run in New Zealand. It was for Tourism New Zealand, but for the international audience. And so, there's between 12 and 8 key markets for Tourism New Zealand globally we need to play in. But we only have about 0.3% of the total global tourism's budget and share of voice. So we need to be very clever about how we actually get our messages out there. We have been working with Tourism New Zealand to move the incredible, iconic 100% pure New Zealand, which used to be about this amazing scenery and open space. And we've been moving it towards 100% pure welcome, which is actually more talking about the experience that overseas visitors have when they come here, this warm, welcoming nature of everyday Kiwis who will go out of their way to make sure you've had a great time. And I think that's in the heart of New Zealand culture is we want to do that. But without the budgets to be on TV internationally, we had to create a really quite different campaign. So we created a campaign called Good Morning World, which was actually not just one piece of work. It was 365 pieces of film, one for every single day. So on that, to better show our welcome to the world where they might not have ever come to New Zealand, how do we express that? We looked at some of the other interesting insights, which is, New Zealand is one of the first countries in the world to see the light every single day. So we're up a couple of hours before everyone else. That predominantly played in digital channels, Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, etc. But it was really interesting because it was the way to better show a broader view of New Zealand than ever before, more than you could ever just show on a 90-second TVC. But it created viewing habits, and it created, a huge amount of engagement with overseas potential tourists. We had about 12 million likes and comments, and by the end of the campaign, we had hundreds of people, begging for us to not stop it. And I think it's the first time I've ever done an advertising campaign where people have begged for it to continue.
Tourism New Zealand is quite an interesting client in the sense that it wants to bring people here, which is a sort of, a good sort of balance of trade thing. And obviously we have a whole sector associated with it, but it's also a not uncomplicated industry. We're a long way from anywhere, so there are AMLs associated with it. And part of what government has been talking about successive governments have talked about is moving up the value chain and trying to get a kind of, let's just say it, richer kind of and higher spending type of tourist here. And you saw, I thought, some fairly impolitic statements from Damien O'Connor recently about certain tourism businesses potentially needing to close, kind of thing. To what extent are you engaged with those conversations within the industry, so that within the sector and that link between government and industry, and how you kind of, without trading off an exclusivity, can start to move from, and even down to, like, with 100% pure New Zealand, there was for quite a while a sense that we were trading off something that wasn't as true as it once would have been. And to what extent did that drive the desire to reorientate around a different element of what people get when they get here?
Well, I think going back to the start of that, excellent question and multi-pronged question really is that I don't think that we've ever gone out to try or Tourism New Zealand has ever gone out to attract low-value customers, because as you point out, it takes a long time to get to New Zealand. It's expensive to get to New Zealand. And so when they come here, they generally want to have a longer experience. And so therefore, by default, they're going to be more high-value tourists. It's interesting. It's not like in Europe where you can get a 40 quid flight and you can get like 40 quid hotel rooms for a night. You can't do that in New Zealand. It takes effort and planning to get here. So I don't think Tourism New Zealand has ever consciously gone out to get low value customers, because I think it's all New Zealand is self-selecting. People want to come here for, I think, it's that almost that once in a lifetime experience, and our job really is to get that, is to change it from I want to go to New Zealand one day to I want to go to New Zealand today, and I think that's the real hope of what we will be doing coming out of lockdown whenever that happens in terms of actually fully opening up our borders.
The Fold is brought to you by O Media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa, with over 4,000 out-of-home advertising sites nationwide across both street furniture and retail centres. I'm super grateful to O Media for enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Raising capital or taking your business to the world? Investment Fix has the lowdown on everything you need to make it happen. This season, we're exploring the US market, the opportunities it offers, what it takes to grow a business there, and the best way to approach investors. Join some of the superstars of the investment and business world as they share advice from their time in the US so you can make your mahi count in this massive market. The Investment Fix podcast, brought to you by Invest New Zealand. Tune in today.
Even though our borders were closed and it was literally impossible to get anyone here who wasn't wearing, a bright turtleneck into the country as a tourist, we never stopped advertising overseas. And you can sort of see why everyone involved in the chain would want to continue doing that, even though, for a long periods of last year there was, there were no vaccines and there was no sense of when that reopening might come. How do you sort of how do you and Tourism New Zealand, sorry to harp on this, I just think they're a really interesting client because of how big the industry they serve is. How do you sort of justify that continued spend in the absence of any ability to do something with that?
Well, I guess there's a couple of key points here. Is the spend and the way that spend was apportioned, etc., does change. The second thing and the broader thing you're pointing at, which is why continue to be a brand in the hearts and minds of potential overseas tourists when they can't come here. And because in one sense it's illogical, but then the other sense it's very logical. If you look at all of the marketing best practice that is globally available, etc., is that the idea of going dark, which is what they call it, just turning off everything, does have massive knock-on effects in terms of how much you need to spend to then turn on the light again. The other thing to consider is that a trip to New Zealand is often 12, 24, or even longer months in the planning. So by us staying alive in the hearts and minds in multiple different ways to overseas tourists is very, very important, because yes, they can't come here now, but we want them to come here in a year and in 2 years and in 3 years. So it's taking a much more longer term view of that.
So speaking of, the way that Special has grown steadily, deliberately, to the point where, a lot of the agencies here, which we think of just because they've been around so long as being kind of New Zealand agencies, on one level they are, but they're almost all owned by multinational groups, the Saatchis, the DDBs, the Calenzos and so on. And you're actually sort of reversing that process. You now have offices in multiple overseas countries. What gave you the audacity? Because those are big, really well capitalised, very valuable listed entities, and you're sort of going and camping on their lawn.
Yeah, it's an interesting one. We started 13 years ago now, and just up the road in Kingsland in an old, what used to be an ex-movie theatre, and we had, as we say, we had one desk and 3 chairs and no clients. And I guess that's the start of it, is you got to start with ambition. You got to start to believe that we could do things a better way, that we could do work and ideas that we wouldn't traditionally be able to get through the companies that we're working in before. And, it's the usual startup story, as you want to be able to show the world. So 13 years later, we're the New Zealand Agency of the Year. We've won all of the titles available to us now, and we are really the leading creative force in the country. But it's kind of you kind of think, is that it? Or there's always more. There's always a broader horizon line. So 7 years ago, we took the unusual move of trying to open an office in Australia. 7 years later, Special in Sydney is now the Agency of the Year in Australia. And along the way, we've opened another office. We opened Melbourne, must have been about 9 months ago in the middle of lockdown. And then 7 months ago, we opened in Los Angeles. And I guess this is all just a part of this want to take what I believe is really unique about New Zealand creativity and innovation and strategic and design thinking to the world. And as you spoke on there, most of the world of advertising is owned by holding companies that live in New York, Paris, and London, and that's where they extract their funds to, and that's where they go to. And usually the last office they open up in the world is as far away from those holding companies as the chain goes, and that's generally this country called New Zealand. And so we've always loved the audacity of can't we start something that is the best of New Zealand creativity and then export it to the world? So almost turn the entire marketing world upside down and for us to swim the other way. And we're a couple of stops away from that. As soon as we get an office in France, Japan, and Europe, we would have probably done that. But that is the ambition: create the world's best independent creative company for the world's most ambitious clients.
Seems chill. To what extent is the fact of your being independent has that allowed you? Have you made the fact that you are probably by comparison to them undercapitalized, but you have other things that independence grants you? To what extent has that been a driver of your ability to kind of leap out? As I said, we've been doing it for a long time, so I don't really remember what the world of multinationals was like, but speaking of Special, independence gives us the ability to be able to make our own decisions at the flick of a switch. So if we lose a client, lose revenue, we do not immediately have to let go of staff. We can say, we've got our team, we believe in our people, we'll just take a financial hit, we'll hold on to our team. And that's not what multinationals do. We can invest in other things. So last year we partnered with Semi-Permanent and ATEED and Department of Culture, and to actually become a major sponsor of Semi-Permanent, because we thought it was really important to try and create a cultural highlight in an otherwise very dark year. And then to be able to work with Semi-Permanent to make sure that that tickets got given to about 22 different schools around the country where they wouldn't have usually been able to afford a $300 or $400 ticket. So we can invest in things like that. At Semi-Permanent, we also launched an initiative calling for New Zealand startups. So we put a full-page press out there and did some digital work asking for startups who may well have been a little bit dissuaded by the choppy waters of lockdown and COVID, that they might have put their plans on hold. It's our belief that New Zealand needs more creative-based entrepreneurial companies. This is what's going to drive the entire New Zealand economy going forward, and we have to diversify away from our traditional heartland of industry, etc. So we reached out, and the idea is that we pick three, and we fund them as much as we can in terms of all of our strategic time, design time, digital time, creative strategy, etc. We had over 100 come forward, just some incredible companies, incredible individuals, and we've chosen three and are now working with them. So being independent allows you to do things like that. Also, being independent allows us to make decisions like paying back the wage subsidy. We took the wage subsidy initially when revenue took a big hit at Special, but we were lucky to be able to rebound very quickly, and so we immediately made that decision to pay back the subsidies. Did the exact same thing.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. Look, I know the multinationals. I know that many people that are running the multinational agencies in New Zealand may well have personally wanted to pay that back. But if you look at it, the cold, hard truth is that there's big companies out there who took over $1 million from the New Zealand taxpayer, asked their staff to take wage cuts as well. And then instead of paying any of that back, they took that money and they gave it to those holding companies overseas. Now, that's their personal choice, but that's not Special's choice, and that's what independence gives you. And I think doing the right thing in the country that you live in that has supported you and where your staff and the majority of your brands you work on live in, I think it's really important to do the right thing.
So, there's sort of two things that naturally spring out of that to me. One is like, because I agree, I find that the kind of private equity firms and it's telling to me that the majority of the firms that have, the big firms that have returned the wage subsidy have been New Zealand owned and operated, and the big ones that have kept it have had remote ownership. And I do think there should be a cost to that, because that is a burden they're placing on future generations of New Zealanders. When you are going to, does that factor into when you're making decisions about clients you would approach and work with? And that, I guess that's the sort of, the kind of value, and the sort of values and stakeholder capitalism and so on. These are rising tides at the moment. So where does that line sit for you personally?
Yeah, there's industries that we don't go near, but they're the fairly obvious ones. There is, we've always had a bit of a, one of the very first campaigns we did was the Green Party election campaign in 2008, and a recent campaign we've just done at the end of last year for the election was for an organisation called Every Kiwi Vote Counts, and this was trying to get that million New Zealanders who are overseas and the ones who are eligible to vote, because we think that that democracy is really important. We think it's very important to make it easier and to encourage every New Zealander who can vote to vote, because we think that's a healthy and stronger democracy. So we'll put our efforts and our time and our resources into those things that we really believe in to make the world a better place.
How does that square with Uber Eats as a client? Just knowing what both the sort of personal kind of chaos that came with Travis Kalanick, and also the immense complexity of what Uber does to the world, from clogging up cities to, the treatment of its drivers as contractors and so on. Do you, and to the way that it has kind of hollowed out the hospitality industry in so many places and being blamed for that. You can argue about whether that's right or wrong. How do you sort of was that something that was part of the sort of decision-making process, or was it just like, holy shit, that's an enormous global client with instant name recognition around the world, and the work we could do would be transformative?
Well, when we first started working with Uber Eats in Australia, which must have been about 5 years ago, they were number 3 in that market. It's Uber Eats, not Uber Rider. I guess if you look at it from one point of view, is it makes the world a better place for so many people. It used to be that you had on your fridge you had a pizza, curry, or a Thai restaurant, but this now gives you choice of which amazing things come from it. And so this also allows multiple restaurants to thrive and to spring up in different ways. And you can see during lockdown just the actual beneficial effect of having Uber Eats being able to keep these restaurants going. We now do Uber Eats for North America and Canada and about 6 other territories around the world, and we just did our first Super Bowl commercial, but that's linked with them also giving, I think, 20 million in support to local restaurants over there. So you can either say, I don't like the PR I read about the company now, or you can work with them saying this is an amazing company and they're doing everything they can to do better. Recently in America, they've started, it's an incredible company because they are forever moving, forever progressing, forever changing, forever trying to get better. So now in America, you can choose if you want to get picked up by a female driver, for example. And that is really important. I've got a daughter, and so I know that if she comes out of a bar or a nightclub, for her to have the ability to be able to have a female driver is a very progressive and interesting thing. Furthermore, the female drivers can select to only pick up female passengers, and so this is actually changing the world in many ways. And look, that they will be the first to admit that they're forever trying to change. Their CEOs. A fairly inspirational new CEO, and so I think that's a company that is committed to being better, but also committed to making the world a better place.
Does that sort of, because I mean the advertising industry doesn't have a great reputation across as a place to work across multiple ways, but Special does, by my understanding. How do you and you some of that you nodded out with the with not making people redundant, with not forcing people to take pay cuts during lockdown. To describe the importance of people and what value beyond just being a decent corporate citizen that provides.
Yeah, look, it's about culture. Culture, if there could be a different word to describe culture in advertising and design companies, I'd love to hear it. It's a people business, so it's about attracting the best talent and then allowing the best workplace for that talent to do their best work. So it's in your absolute best interest to make it the best possible workplace you can work in. Like, we do so many things. Like we every Friday we put on lunch for the entire agency because it's time for us to down tools and share a bite to eat and actually have a chat to people where you might be too busy to otherwise. We do all sorts of things. Like if you make it through 10 years at Special, we give you 10 weeks off. We do all sorts of things like the exchange programs where we will periodically it was supposed to be every 6 months, but lockdown sort of scuppered that a bit. We'll fly a really well-performing or loved or liked staff member and their family or their partner to go across to Sydney to check out the office over there and then spend the weekend there. So we're constantly trying to do everything we can to make it the best place to work in New Zealand because we want the best talent in New Zealand.
One thing which a friend of mine who works in the agency world has developed a thesis on is the extent to which awards have come to unnaturally dominate the sort of mind share of creatives.
This is a good question. Keep going. Yeah.
So, her thesis on it is actually Lee Lowndes, who runs our creative studio Daylight, so I should give her credit for it. She's basically of the opinion that the award almost becomes the client and that the client's needs get sort of subsumed to the need of the individual creative to be seen to collect awards, which will then further their career. And there's almost, like, at times she would characterize it as like an irritation that the client might have a view on some of that kind of thing. Do you think that's a fair diagnosis? And how do you kind of, in an industry where awards are a kind of currency, maintain the correct balance of that tension?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. Awards, pretty shiny things, but also very dangerous things. You want to obviously have your work applauded by your peers, to be able to be held up as extremely effective pieces of work. They are in some ways the best way to market your agency to future brands, etc. You can say, we've done this work, it's achieved these results. And that's a combination of choosing the right awards to enter. I should say also that awards are extremely expensive and they're time consuming and they are distracting. So we will never do a piece of work with the express desire or to actually win a piece of work. We always do work that we believe will hopefully radically transform a client's business for the better, and we use creativity to do that. Then, of course, we will enter awards if we think that work has got a chance of winning. But up against the other multinationals, we will always spend a fraction of what they will spend. So, look, it's a thing that's actually really close to my heart because it's a how do you actually, which awards are valid, because there's too many of them out there. And it also comes down to it comes down to interesting things such as our Agency of the Year awards. Are they based on how good the work is or how much average work you've entered, therefore to get enough points to win the Agency of the Year? So that's a personal little thing for me that we should probably skip past, otherwise I'll start ranting.
That's right. I've got plenty of those as well. We're sort of coming towards the end of our time, but and this is to a certain extent circling back to the start, but and this is honestly probably one of my personal bugbears, but I have this sort of feeling based on all of the kind of endless data that you consume that the complexities of engaging with just how hard it is to reach, particularly the sort of the audiences that aren't there for linear television is not something that big media agencies in particular, if I'm honest, have meaningfully engaged with to the extent that they could. And certainly that given the quantum of audience that's there, that the effort, the spend, the creativity in terms of what you put in front of them versus the big TV audience, it just feels like there is still some level of, that's a thing we'll figure out at the end, rather than that's a thing that we should think about from the very start. And further, there's just a huge opportunity if you're one of the brands that doesn't do that with a sort of with a cynical lens to go, well, let's think about those people first, because almost like the TVC is the relatively easy audience to find. Let's start with the hard part. Do you see that there is enough done on that media agency side and that brands are really truly engaging with it? I mean, it's 2021.
Yeah.
You're right. We're 15 plus years into the social web, and still it feels like a grind at times.
Yeah. So we've just recently extended our capabilities to be, PR and to be media, because we believe that creativity plays a really important role in those disciplines as well. Here's a really good example that we did for Spinoff. Must have been about 5 years ago, where, Spinoff, we've got a brand platform of pure potential. Obviously, Spinoff's triple distilled. But it's also got great potential as an alcohol to mix with anything, whether it's grapefruit juice, orange juice, etc. So it's one of the most flexible drinks. So that's all cool. But then when you're trying to target an interesting audience, we chose Instagram, and this was one of the Instagram was one of the first times when film was actually used, being used on Instagram. Before that, it used to just be stills. Now it's all completely video. So we created a campaign called Instagram Your Fridge, where we asked people to take a photograph of their fridge and just gram us, and then we had mixologists that would recognize what's in their fridge, whether it was milk or orange juice, whatever, and we would concoct a cocktail for them, and then send back that film. And it got, shared and viewed and liked over 1 million times. But here is a really interesting example of using creativity and a channel, Instagram, uniquely to be able to really target their audience with what they want, as opposed to just saying, here's a buy this product type thing. So I think the more creativity you can use, the more you can understand your audience, the more you can do some really interesting things that make the channels hopefully a better place to be in, as opposed to just being spammed with advertising.
All right, Tony, thank you so much. It's so fascinating to me, the kind of the complexity of these issues in this era, and I feel like if more people would sort of be excited by that rather than frightened by it, then we'd be in a better place. But yeah, thank you so much.
Hey,
for coming
thank you.
on the Fold.
It's been great chatting. Cheers.
That was The Fold, brought to you by our partners at oOh!media, making brands unmissable and public spaces better across Aotearoa. Huge thanks to oOh!media for sponsoring this episode of The Fold and enabling us to make unmissable connections with Kiwis.
Ready to rediscover the joys of cycling? With over 300 kilometres of cycle paths across Tāmaki Makaurau, jumping on your bike and going for a ride is such a fun way to discover the city from a different perspective. Cycling is getting more and more popular across Auckland, so now's a great time to join the hype and give cycling a go. Head to at.govt/cycling to find your nearest cycleway today.
The Spinoff Podcast Network.